Well, welcome back to Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
And today I wanted to talk about bias. So I've been going through a training course, a leadership training course, and this week's lesson was all about biases and the things that we have from our past, from our present, that are impacting our potential for interaction with others, impacting our leadership, impacting the way that we interact with others. So I thought it was a perfect topic to explore for our podcast today.
Yeah, except I'm a little bit biased about that subject.
Oh, yeah? Well, we can dig into it. I found there were some exercises around this. So there's like a 90-minute training module that we do in a webinar type setting, and then there's some training materials you have to do. There was a TED Talk that it linked to and how to watch a TED Talk, and then it had us fill out this form, basically listing 3 groups of people with whom we had a bias. And then it went on to ask, what does that bias look like? How is it impacting you? How is it potentially impacting your community? And then the last question was, how is it impacting your leadership? And I thought those were really good and curious questions. And I'm certainly not going to ask you to say out loud, any group that you have a bias against. But as I was walking through that exercise, I found the question of kind of like the origin story of that bias, why did it start, was running through my head. And I thought that was ultimately curious to me.
This will not surprise you, but when you said that, I started thinking of positive bias. Astronauts, people who volunteer in the community. I started thinking of positive attributes and biases I have towards people. Not every astronaut can run a marathon and is in perfect shape.
Nope.
Especially these days. I think that may have been true in the past. But I do have biases with certain groups. I think we all do, mainly because our brain is trying to take in, these days, 3,432 pieces of information each day. And so we naturally try to categorize and put things into things. And so, I have a bias about people who are volunteers with Big Brothers Big Sisters. I have a bias about people who are volunteers. The guy who came and picked up extra furniture that I had laying around for ISI, the group that helps out international students. So it's funny that you say that, because I wasn't thinking negative bias, I was thinking positive bias.
That is pretty fascinating, and I would say the lesson is inherently about any negative bias that you would have, because it's trying to get people to kind of face the reality of why do you think certain ways. The TED Talk that was linked to this particular week's lesson was a woman who teaches these kinds of things. Like, that is her job, to go into corporations and organizations to teach people to be able to see their own biases. And she was recounting a story where she had gone into a group and she had said something about us examining our own biases, and somebody made a comment like, "Oh, I don't have any biases. I don't see race. I don't see all these things. I don't have any biases." And her kind of commentary, maybe not directly to that person, was, baloney. We all have biases. And she was an African American woman, and she was talking about her experience of getting on a plane right after that session, and the voice that came over the intercom to announce their flight schedule, whatever, was the pilot, and it was a woman. And she said she inwardly was like, "Woohoo, a woman pilot! We've broken the glass ceiling, so to speak, and up there in the stratosphere," was her words. And then she said, 30 minutes into flight, when things started getting really bumpy, she found herself thinking, "Man, I hope this woman knows how to fly." And she said it was a really eye-opening moment for her, because on one hand, she celebrated the fact that it was a woman pilot, but just as quickly she pivoted, because when things got a little bit rocky, her bias was maybe a guy should be in charge.
A guy, or the best person, regardless of guy or girl. I guess I think that's a reasonable question too, and I hope that as people are listening to this, we can have an open and honest discussion about this, because we all have biases. I'm not kidding when I say I have a bias about biases, because I think we sometimes overuse them to explain things and fall into patterns of behavior that are unwarranted in given situations. And so I don't I don't want to have negative biases and put people in a box. I know that my brain does that naturally, and I try to give people the benefit of the doubt if they are expressing to me that they aren't like what my bias is, regardless of what group they're in, or even if they're an individual that I've noticed certain patterns in that they're working on, and maybe they've improved, and I should, acknowledge that. I love the fact that we're talking about it. I hope people can come at this with a real curiosity and not judgment about people who might say something as they're investigating their own biases.
Well, I think that's key, right? I mean, I think all of us doing that introspective work of asking those questions, do we have biases, positive or negative? If they're negative biases, why do we have them and where did they originate? And then ultimately, what do you do about it? I think that was a key component.
And do they serve me?
Sure, absolutely.
That's the big deal, is do they serve me?
Yeah.
It doesn't serve me to think that the woman who's in the pilot seat is not qualified because she's a woman.
That's
It
true.
certainly doesn't serve me if I'm on the plane.
Yeah, midway between locations, right? Yeah, no, it doesn't serve you at all. It's a very fascinating exploration though, and it's very eye-opening. And, as I was having to just, in order to complete this assignment and get my CEUs, like, you've got to fill all this stuff out. And so I get to, that's right, I get to fill all this stuff out. And I was really thinking about it and doing that introspective work and what biases do I have? And then the follow-up question about how does that impact the people that you serve? And so I will be forthcoming, and you're welcome to. I hope this doesn't come out as a judgment against me. I hope you continue that curious posture, but I'll be forthcoming with an example because I think it's very pertinent. So I think I've always had a bias against people with facial tattoos.
Ah.
I was trying to explore why. Did something happen with one in particular individual that made me nervous? Did something happen in my childhood? I don't really know, but I've always had this correlation in my mind that people with a lot of facial tattoos are gang affiliated and therefore they are unsafe. So that is a bias I have had in my own mind. And then as it asks the question is, how does that impact the people that you serve? Well, I work for an organization that cares for victims of human trafficking. And I will tell you that the last task force meeting that I was part of, the young woman who was selected to lead and introduce had a lot of facial tattoos. And I was taken aback because these are, mostly professionals that are pretty, traditional looking, I guess I will say. And she absolutely will stand out. And then she said, very timidly, she said, I was a trafficking victim. I've been helped by organizations. I'm on the other side and I want to give back and I want to participate in this setting where she can help facilitate some of the conversation. And it was that one sentence of explanation that completely flips the narrative, right? It's that's a rough looking person, right? To she was a victim of trafficking and she's come through unbelievable horrors and tragedy and now she's on the side where she wants to help others. What in the world am I doing with my bias in my brain towards her?
There was a lot of biases in all those sentences. And I was picking up and just trying to listen about that and curiously. And I realized that you're equating professionalism with a certain standard.
I think probably, yeah.
And as we talk about wisdom is in the definition of terms, I heard that professional people look kind of normal. And so I think that's interesting. And our professional people, so the definition of professional is somebody who's getting paid to do what they're doing, as opposed to an amateur who's not.
Sure.
That's how we used to do the Olympics, for instance, is you had to be an amateur athlete, not a professional athlete. That's gone away now, but the point is, if she was being paid to be in that room, she's a professional by definition. Now, when you talked about a professional, I think you were talking about acting professionally or a certain definition of professionalism that you have and that is your working definition. I think the thing to think about bias is, are we willing to work on our working definitions of things?
No, but you're right. I mean, that's a little bit of call out there.
Well,
But
sorry.
you're totally right. Yeah, I mean, I think we do. We all, for whatever reason, and I think that's really where the curiosity comes in, is the what is the reason? We have something in our head. We equate a group of people to look a certain way or do a certain thing or behave in a certain manner. And are we willing to work on that definition? Because by and large, there's going to be multiple people that kind of break that pattern, and they absolutely need to be respected and honored and championed in the same manner as whoever we think ideally fits in that bubble.
There's so much in that little story that you did there. She first of all, she said one sentence, and it melted everyone's heart in the room, and everyone there realized that she's uniquely qualified to be in that room and to be part of the discussion. She may not act professionally, though, by anyone's standards, because maybe she doesn't know how.
Sure.
What does that even mean? Right? How did we come up with what professional is as a society, as Americans living in this country, in this time, in this season, in the state of New Mexico? We all have professionalism, by the way, has different definitions regionally.
Sure.
I'll never forget my days at Intel, and we prided ourselves on, not quite T-shirt, but I mean at T-shirt and jeans, holy jeans even. But if someone came in to interview or they were selling us something, we expected a suit. Isn't that funny? Right? Because we expected a certain level of, look, we can do that because we're part of the company, but you can't because you have to come in and present well.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't just assume that you're in. Right? So we play with these kinds of things all the time. What is professional? In California, it might be, jeans and a T-shirt and how well you speak. Whereas on the East Coast or Chicago, you better come in with a suit and a tie, right? So I think that we just uncovered a lot of biases
I think you're
that
right.
we all have.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key to realize, is that we don't get to say you're biased to someone without those three fingers pointing at us.
Absolutely.
Because we all have biases. As a matter of fact, the statement of you saying to someone you're biased has some bias in it,
Sure.
I would submit. And so we have to be careful throwing that around. I think we have to be careful thinking that we know what's right and other people don't, in general, whether it comes to bias about a group. I think that was a leading question about name three groups of people you have bias about. Bias is a bigger word than that. And it doesn't have to be negative.
True.
And you can have bias about a thing. I expect these things or these animals to act in a certain way. Bias probably came from the fact when we were Neanderthals and cavemen and women, and we had to have a bias about tigers because they were going to tear us up and kill us. And so we developed a bias about certain animals, about whether we could take them or they could take us.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that the way we're using bias here is in a specific way, and it absolutely needs to be talked to, but I think it is in a limiting way.
Well, so hopefully this is stirring up thoughts for everyone listening, and again, I hope this is an introspective exercise and not so much of, look what a fool Birga is. But, certainly I recognize that I have pitfalls in the way that I think, and I did appreciate not having to publicly proclaim what my biases were, but I did appreciate the exercise of having to walk through that mental process of, where did this originate? How is it impacting the way that you're able to serve? And then the last question is, how is that impacting your leadership?
Exactly.
And so that's another fascinating question for anybody that's in a position of leadership. And, if we're just going to the bias example of dress code and what constitutes a professional, New Mexico is a really casual state, as you well know, and as you've alluded to, even with the Intel workforce, which kind of surprised me, honestly. I'm a jeans in a T-shirt kind of a girl. I very seldom have professional, I'm saying that in air quotes, professional apparel on unless, I feel like it really warrants it. But if you were to have a change of leadership and somebody that came in from the East Coast, I think I would instantly be looked at as sloppy, unprofessional, and maybe even the assumption being made that I'm not good at my job simply based on how I'm dressed.
Well, and some people show up to a Zoom call and and they are dressed differently than everybody else in the Zoom call as a result, because the Zoom call might be people from Boston, Chicago, etc., who are expected, they're in at least a collared shirt and maybe even a jacket, and you might show up in a t-shirt, right, or pajamas, right, and they may have a bias against you as a result.
Certainly.
Just like you did with the young woman who walked into the meeting. And so now, again, what do you do with those biases? By the way, we talk about groups. There are, I think that was kind of leading towards ethnic groups or other groups like that. I think society has biases. I think if you ask somebody in the 50s about the media, and then you ask those same group of people today, you'd get different answers and biases about the media, for instance. I call it, Walter Cronkite versus, now. And I think we have collective biases as societies.
Oh, for sure. Political parties, ethnic issues, of course, that have come up through our history, economic biases, the whole slew of them. And so, I like your question of how is that serving me? If you have identified that, this is where my mind goes in these particular categories, how is this serving me? But then to the better, maybe not better question, the follow-up question is, what do I do to change it? Going back to the TED Talk that I was referencing, and I will do my best to try to remember to put the link to that TED Talk in the show notes so people can see it directly. But the woman was talking about, so she is an African-American woman, and her colleague was, I believe she was Korean, and they were walking somewhere at night in a city where they were hosting some sort of a educational session, so a city unfamiliar to them, and they got turned around and they were uncertain of where they were. And there was a young black man coming from the opposite direction. And the black woman's thinking, great, I'm going to go after him for information because I know I can trust him with him giving me the information I need. Whereas the Korean woman felt afraid, and she admittedly said, she's like, this is my livelihood. This is my job, is to teach against bias. And I'm ashamed that was where my thought went, but I was afraid and I wanted to go a different direction. And so they were having this conversation between the two of them. And so this woman goes on to say, her, I guess, instruction or her suggestion on how to help eliminate bias, especially around stereotypes around young black men, is to really educate yourself on these predominant black men in our culture and in our community that have been game changers in science and entertainment, in religion, in politics, and to familiarize yourself to not make the stereotype, like whatever the stereotype is around young black men, to expand it, not to expand it, to do the opposite, to eliminate that stereotype, to say there are so many incredible black men that have contributed to our community, and to begin to kind of retrain the brain in that manner. She goes on to share some other things, and again, I will link that TED Talk into the show notes so people can go watch it for themselves. But I'm now thinking, quickly on the fly, how does that apply if we're talking about biases against people with, tattoos, biases against people who dress in a certain manner, who behave in a certain manner? Because it's not always that clear what to do in order to retrain your brain from thinking in a particular way.
So let me respond honestly and transparently to that story. I'm not concerned whether the person is black or white or whatever. I'm in a strange neighborhood. I don't know how people act in that neighborhood. I don't need to go educate myself on the fact that young black men do great things. I already know that. I'm more concerned about the fact that I'm in a situation, this happens when I go to other countries. I'd much rather go with somebody who's from there, who can tell me where to go and what to do and what the customs are. I'd be more worried about violating a custom or being in the wrong place at the wrong time than I would be about the color of the skin of the man approaching me. So this is what I'm saying. I think we sometimes, I think that example, as long as it's just used to provoke thought, is fine. But I think we're more nuanced than that. I think that I sometimes think we try to go into situational awareness that is kind of manufactured to show us something and to discuss it, which is fine. But I'm not sure how real it is. right? Again, I'd be more concerned about being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a neighborhood where I don't understand what the customs are late at night. I'd be more concerned about somebody, sneaking around a neighborhood checking car door handles. I'm more concerned about that behavior than I am about who's doing it. And so I think that's so. I'm interested in the stories that are being told in this session and what we are to learn. Should you just go up and approach anybody, a stranger in a neighborhood you don't know?
No, I don't think that's wise.
Or do you assume that they're a Nobel Prize winner or have done great things in their lives?
No, but I don't think that was the exercise.
It's not.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to respond honestly to, I think we don't need to set ourselves up for things that aren't there. Right?
Certainly.
And to discuss things like that, we can discuss overall safety and concerns for safety and what does that mean and how does it lead to a different behavior or what should we do in that situation?
Well, yeah, I think ultimately this boils down to, and I know we've had this conversation in other podcasts, just the golden rule principle. Are we treating others the way that we would want to be treated? That, I think, is such a huge guiding force for how we can interact with honor and respect and dignity to anyone and everyone. And I think we do have to be situationally aware. To your point, there's going to be times when you are in unfamiliar territory, and is the judgment you're making in the moment based on someone's appearance or based on the fact that you are, out of your element and you don't know what your responsibility or your role is?
You and I are both have done decades of work with homeless in this city, and my biases towards homeless is most homeless people are not going to attack me, and they're not going to be scary, and I shouldn't be afraid of them. And I say hi to them, and I interact with them because of my, soup kitchen days at noonday, etc. But there are going to be situations, if it's late at night, I'm not going to come up to a homeless encampment.
Sure.
Because I don't know the customs, I don't know the people, I don't know, especially by myself, right? If I'm there to help and I'm there to provide aid somehow, then that's a different story. But, again, I think that situationally we have to think about, we should separate the situation from the bias, is all I'm trying to say. But understanding that I do have bias. And I think it's interesting that the way the story is told is that she feels comfortable going up to him because he's black and she's black, which I think is interesting, because that may or may not be true.
Yeah, familiarity, I suppose, in some regard. So it's an interesting conversation. It's a complex one. It is an intense one. It's one that can absolutely get heated very quickly. And so I think this is a prime example of why we need to stay curious. We need to be curious about our own thinking, our own habits, our own, upbringing and things that we believe without even knowing why we believe them. And then also curious about others. Why is that the way that it is?
Why is that the way it is?
Yeah. So, all right, we will wrap that up with just that encouragement to stay curious. And you are always welcome to send us some feedback. CuriosityNotJudgment.com is the website, and we always appreciate you being part of each weekly episode, and we will catch you again next week.
Take care.